In the second lecture on the topic of diffusion of innovation and networks, we're going to look at the non-linear model of diffusion. In the past lecture, we have covered the traditional diffusion theory, and we have highlighted that the way to go from the innovators through to the majority of adopters is to follow a linear path whereby the success encountered with the previous category of adopters, say the innovators, is used to diffuse into the next category, which is the early adopters, and then to use the adoption in the early adopter category as a momentum to transfer into the early majority and then into the late majority. In this lecture, we're going to characterize better the categories of innovators, but we're going to see as well that there is a gap between two crucial categories of adopters. The idea of the nonlinear model of innovation has been suggested by in a book called Crossing the Chasm. Crossing the Chasm has become one of the most cited books and is especially popular with practitioners. Let's start from a definition of market according to the writer of this book called Geoffrey Moore. A market will be composed of four essential elements. Of course, customers, let's say adopters. Then some products to be sold or services. Third, the selling is based on needs or wants by customers. And fourth, and this is the real innovation with respect to a traditional definition of markets, is reference each other. According to Geoffrey Moore, according in general to literature, marketing, sociology, and so on, people buy goods when goods have a level of uncertainty, so we don't understand how they work, like buying a transaction, going to a dentist or a doctor, or a very new good that we don't know how it works, say the iWatch or space tourism, according to recommendations from people they trust, usually friends or colleagues. So what is crucial in the definition of market is a set of conversations that persuade potential adopters to buy, adopt, or use a certain services. So if we take the network of conversations going on, those networks will define a specific markets. This also means that if you've got two networks of conversations going on about the same good but across two different social networks, effectively they behave as two different markets. Now, let's start characterizing the five categories of adopters. We will concentrate on the first three, that is innovators, early adopters, and early majority. We are going to ignore, to a certain extent, the late majority and the laggards. We ignore the late majority because the dynamics of the late majority tends to follow. It's similar to the dynamic of the early majority. We're going to ignore the laggards because from a point of view of adoption, they basically never adopt goods that have a level of risk related to the uncertainty of specific good. For instance, these are the people that buy a fridge when the only thing they have to do is to plug it in. Otherwise, they just don't adopt. We know that there's a class of categories who don't have a mobile phone because of a number of reasons. Those are the laggards. Okay, but let's start from the first category of innovators, of adopters, and we call them the innovators. By definition, they are the first to adopt. Notice that if we now frame adoption in terms of our discussion of cascades of information, these people if we represent them as nodes, they become active even if no other nodes around themselves has become active. Meaning, in terms of network, they're extremely reactive to novelty. In sociological terms, innovators are characterized by the fact that they simply love technology. They want to be the first to buy. Technology and science is a central part of their life. And what is important to understand in terms of diffusion of innovation is that when they adopt something, when they buy something new, they do so because they're interested in the technology and the science behind, in the functionality per se, not necessarily in the market or in the use, in the function. They're interested in to discover how it works. And they usually tend to remain in the technology and the science area. These people are not usually influential, which means often they don't have much money. They usually don't sit, in corporate boards, so they are the first to buy, but usually they buy cheap. They are popularly described as techies, as nerds, as deviants. They tend to be the radical innovation people. Finally, because these people, from a social network point of view, are mostly interested in science and technology, their conversations, remember that according to the definition of markets by Geoffrey Moore, conversations define a market together with needs, wants, and customers. In this case, they may be customers, but because they're principally interested in technology, most of their conversations will be with other people sharing same hobbies. Remember the principle of homophily. A typical example of an innovator is Steve Wozniak. Steve Wozniak is the co-founder of Apple and is represented on the right hand side of the picture, and what you see there is in the picture is Steve Wozniak showing the motherboard of what will become Apple I to Steve Jobs. Of course, the pair Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak is extremely interesting because they represent different elements of people involved at the beginning of the diffusion of a certain product. In that case, the product was the Apple I. I invite you now to stop a moment at the lecture and have a look at the short video. This is a video representing Steve Wozniak 20 or 30 years later, describing how he came out with the idea for the Apple II. It's very short, it's about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, but what I invite you to do is to pay attention to what Steve Wozniak doesn't talk about, what is missing in his presentation. What is the type of language he's using? Is it the language of a businessman or is it the language of a technologist? Remember, for us, Steve Wozniak represents the paradigm of an innovator. Once you're done with it, come back and let's move on to the next typology of in the diffusion of innovation scheme. This typology has got to do with the early adopter. Now, this is a different category than the innovator. They like the innovators, they adopt very early in technology life cycle, but differently from the innovators, they are first to appreciate or imagine the market use of a technology. For the innovators, we said they're passionate about technology, they want to understand how it works and what is new in it. These people are the early adopters. Instead, are interested in the actual use, what people are going to do with that technology, how that technology is going to change social practice, communication, transportation, etc. Basically, how technology is going to change the way we live our lives. They tend to operate in not yet established technological markets. Why that? Well, this is common also for innovators, because this is technology at the beginning. Technology at the beginning has not been completely defined in terms of market uses, in terms of supply chains, in terms of maintenance. These are technologies, these are products at the beginning of their life cycles. The typical examples we have been living through is the smartwatches. Smartwatches have been there on the fringes of market. It's not exactly clear what to do with them, how to use them, whether they will diffuse, whether it will be the only one person left with iWatch, etc., etc., etc. So they operate in not yet established technological market. The buying decision, the buying decision is based on a promise of a radical change that the new technology will enable. The early adopters are called visionaries, and Steve Jobs has represented again the paradigm of this type of people. They tend to now, contrary to the innovators, they tend to be highly visible. They become the prophets of a new revolution. whether the profits is the profits in telecommunications, Steve Jobs, whether it was profits in mass transportation, Henry Ford, or whether it is a profit of space tourism, called the early adopter Richard Branson. These people are risk takers. They invest a lot, and they want to become extremely well-known people for risk taking. In terms of communication, as the innovators, they tend to be characterized by horizontal communication. By horizontal mean they communicate with people like them. So if you're going to represent now the network of early adopters and early majority, the network of innovators and early adopters, for the early adopters we said they behave as node that may become active in absence of other active nodes. In terms of the early adopters instead, they have a very low threshold. Why? Because they're passionate as well about technology, but they only adopt or promote a technology that promises to deliver a radical change. So they tend to adopt after the innovators. So in terms of our characterization of networks enabling cascades, early adopters adoption is triggered by a connection with at least one innovator. So the threshold rule can be very, very low, but still it needs an innovator in the nearby social networks. They need one innovator as a neighbor, even though they may be surrounded by many non-active nodes. So in terms of contagion, it's mostly of the biological contagion type, not so much a social contagion type. I would invite you now to stop for a moment and watch the video here. The video is short, it's about 3 minutes, and represents the first time that the Apple I was shown to a public. The movie is the video is a movie, so there are actors impersonating the characters, but it is realistic. Something like that might have appeared. What is interesting to me in this video is the language that now Steve Jobs using. Notice the language, notice the style, pay attention to the words that are used. Is that the language of a businessman or a technologist? Do you see elements of strategic thinking in the video? If yes, what? Let me start with a short comment about the two videos you have just seen. The first video, as we said, is Steve Wozniak many years later describing how he came up with the Apple II model. Notice that in his conversation there's never a mention of market-ready terms, competitions, customers, and so on. His talk is about technology, it's about how to build from the ground up a new computer and reducing the number of components, making the architecture compatible with the frequency of television, etc., etc., etc. Typical innovators talk. All about the technology, very little about markets, uses, competitions, and so on and so forth. The second video is exactly the opposite. Now, the second video, as we said, represent what might historically have happened. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak presenting the prototype of the Apple I. They go to a computer geeks club, and notice the type of conversation that takes place within the exchange between Steve Jobs and potential adopters, and especially notice what happens immediately after they go out of the club. The first comment is, we sold 50, so now it's about selling. Notice the excitement, but then the second comment is about IBM and how IBM should be scared about Apple, which was a company that was basically 1 year old, starting in a garage. Notice the surprise of the innovators that is not acquainted to this vision and the strategy of competition. So what matters in this movie is a representation of the psychology and the attitude of an early adopter, the visionary approach, and how this is about selling, competition, strategy, etc., etc., etc. The third important category in the diffusion innovation framework is the early majority. Now, the early majority is a very different category from both the innovators and the early adopters. First, in terms of number, this is a large group. It's about 1/3 of the market. The late majority is about also 1/3 of the market. So the two together forms large part of the target that an innovator, a company producing innovation might target. Now, the symbol of the early majority person is the IBM man or woman. The IBM person is always in a suit, always professional, but not risk friendly. So they only buy when a certain new technology or service has been proven to work in a context which is their context. So they will buy a new resource planning system if that resource planning system has been demonstrated to work in an environment similar to their own environment. It could be a competitor company, or it could be a company in their industrial sector. So they operate in established technological market, whereby the early adopters operate in not yet established technological market, and the early majority buy an incremental productivity, which means they buy returns from use of technology because from whom they get the reference recommendation about what to buy and when to buy. Clearly, these people are pragmatists. They don't trust risk takers. Risk avoiders do not trust risk takers. So the conversation between a typical conversation between an early adopter or an innovator and an early majority might not, or usually does not, lead to adoption. Why? Because psychologically speaking, these people are very, very different. Pragmatists pay attention to other pragmatists. So they buy if there is a reference from a person like them. So their type of communication now tends to be, let's call it vertical, but tends to happen within the same company or within the same industry. This is also a consequence of the fact that they buy only technologies in which they have they operate in established markets. And the late majority, we are not particularly concerned about them, because in the major non-linearity in the diffusion of innovation is between the early adopters and the early majority. Remember what we said about the linear innovation model. We characterized that in terms of 5 categories. The 5 categories, both in the linear and non-linear, in the classical and the chasm model, are based on the attitude toward uncertainty. In the innovators and early adopters, they are happy to live with lots of uncertainty with regard to whether markets are established or not, whether technology will work, whether needs and wants are defined or not, whereby from the early majority on, uncertainty blocks diffusion of innovation in the sectors. We have characterized the general typology of the 5 categories in terms of percentage of users. We said most of the users are in the early majority and the late majority, and in terms of attitude toward risk and or uncertainty. Okay, but in the linear model, it is assumed that the success obtained in a previous segment is enough to move the innovation in the next segment. So having occupied, let's say, the innovators segment, penetration can start in the early adopters. Having conquered the early adopters, diffusion may start, and it can start in the early majority. So the strategic game there is the game of calibrating momentum in order to move from one sector to the other sector. This may work, but not so much for radical innovation. It works probably better for incremental innovation. What happens with radical innovation? What happens with radical innovations, or in other words, with products or services where there's high content of uncertainty with regard to functions, what they do, applications, and which operate in not yet established markets. What usually happens for many technologies, if you look at it in terms of sales, the technology has a relative success when it is introduced in the market, because in the first year or second year, and then somehow the sales stall. So they keep selling, but without ever really increasing volumes. What happens is that a new technology usually finds some buyers in the innovators, and they may find, if it is really new technology, they may find some visionaries that imagine a radical change in society. But then they may fall into the chasm, and the way to reveal whether technology has fallen into the chasm is to ask ourselves whether they have managed to penetrate the early majority field. Very often, and I will give you examples in a moment, technology may fall into the chasm. The chasm means a big gap, like, let's say, in geological terms could be the Grand Canyon. You don't easily move from one side to the other side. Imagine the Grand Canyon in terms of a block to the diffusion of a certain product. Now, if we phrase this in terms of the language of networks, imagine two networks. Let's concentrate only on the early adopters and the early majority. We said that early adopters psychologically are different from the early majority. The early adopters operate happy to take risk and operate in not yet established markets. The early majority instead are pragmatists. They only trust people like them that are not risk takers. So if you try to draw the conversations between risk takers and risk avoiders, simply there's very few conversations, and most of the links through which information and conversations flows of early adopters will be with other early adopters, and most of the links of early majority will be with other early majority. Now, if you think in terms of cascades, now if early majority are surrounded by the early majority, and in terms of the threshold rules, if there are threshold rules relatively high, which we expect to be so because they're not risk takers, now you immediately see that we are in the condition of so-called upper boundary of cascades. We are in the social contagion model because these people pay attention to other people like them, homophily, but we're also in the social contagion model because they don't want to be seen as different from the pack. This is the cohesive externality argument. So they tend to adopt when a sufficient fraction of people like them have adopted. You can immediately see how this creates the gap called the chasm between the early adopters and the early majority. Of course, the two groups are diffident of each other. Visionaries have no respect for the experience that the pragmatists ask in order to adopt. Visionaries, we said, pay little attention to infrastructure, maintenance, sales, whether the legislation has followed the evolution of technology, and so on. Visionaries, in short, like disruption, pragmatists don't. And all these arguments lead to the opening of the chasm between early adopters and early majority. Now, if a technology has fallen into the chasm, how do you try to get it out of it? What Geoffrey Moore suggests in his book Crossing the Chasm is to adopt the so-called beachhead approach. The beachhead approach is the approach that the Allied followed in invasion of Europe during the Second World War in 1944. So they concentrated a huge number of forces on the three well-known in a single spot in Normandy, and they tried to get a beachhead, let's say control of a small area of in that case of the French territory, and use that as a base, as a platform to expand into the rest. So in this strategy, what is difficult is to establish the presence on a single spot, but once you have done that, then you can operate within the internal lines of the enemy. In sales terms, in strategy terms, this means concentrated all the energy of course, early adopters and innovators on a single point of attack, on a single micro applications of the early majority markets. So you concentrate all your energy and in terms of development of a clearly convincing propositions that addresses a clearly perceived need, for small that it is. At the same time, in order to concentrate all your energy on a single spot, you give up potential sales in other sectors that might be promising as well. But in the beachhead approach, you want to get a beachhead in order to use the recommendations, the references of early majority people in order to start that cascade of penetration into the early majority field. So you just ignore other niches. This is not a sales-driven strategy. It's whole product commitment, and the goal is to become market leader in a small niche, and then use the leadership, which means the conversations among early majority people, in order to spread into the rest of the field. A typical example of a technology that has been in the chasm probably until now is the smartwatch. Look at the picture. There are tens of different types of smartwatches. They're all very different in terms of what they do, what applications, whether they relate to a mobile phone or not, what type of operating system they use, etc., etc., etc. Smartphones have been around for many years, but they've always been in the fringe of the market. And then now with the iWatch, probably Apple will play the trick once again and extract a technology that has been into the chasm. Tablets, computers had been around for many years, for decades, but only the force of Apple managed to bridge that chasm and to bring that product to success and wide diffusion. Other products that have been into the chasm, other technologies that are in the chasm, or they are just coming out of it, are, apart from the smartwatch, the Segway. The Segway was introduced in 2001 by an American entrepreneur, and it was announced as a radical change in urban mobility, and especially urban transportation. And the inventor, Nick Kamen, basically announced that the Segway will be to the city what the car was to the city. That means the car enable the emergence of modern cities. That hasn't happened yet. 14 years after introduction, sales have been very disappointing. Applications have been relegated to small niches, like taking tourists to experience short walks or short rides in touristic cities. You find sometimes police in airports. Sometimes they are used in supermarkets, but more or less they are far from getting the early majority. Yes, they are innovators have adopted them, and the adopters have adopted them, but the early majority is far from adopting it. Household robots is probably another technology that has been there for a while. They've been there for probably decades, but they have failed to really get into the mainstream market of technologies for the common household. There are signs that now are becoming more diffused. Another technology that I find very interesting is, I mentioned the tablets. The e-book also came out of the chasm because of Amazon, the Kindle. Another technology that I find very, very interesting is the VC. The VC has been around for 150 or more years. In the West, that's the only type. Okay, there could be micro differences, but that's the only type of technology we have for physiological functions. If you go to Asia, specifically to Japan and Korea, you will find that in most houses you don't find a passive monofunction toilet, you find let's call it smart toilet, which is multifunction because it combines VC and bidet. At the same time can have music, can have technology, the seat warms up to the temperature pre-established, etc, etc, etc. It may be controlled by a remote control, it may interact with television, etc, etc, etc. In the article that you find here, you'll find how this technology, although it is so promising, has failed to establish a niche, even a niche in the Western market. This is a multi-billion or hundreds of billions markets waiting for somebody to extract this technology from the chasm in all the Western world, with the exception, of course, of Japan and Korea. Finally, I would like you to try as homework, I'd like you to try to apply the knowledge we have gained in diffusion and in cascades and in networks in order to try to see what happens if you draw yourself a network. Draw yourself a network of 3 types of nodes. The nodes are the innovators, early adopters, and early majority. Imagine that you have 50 nodes. The first question is how many what is the percentage of early adopters, what is the percentage of early majority and innovators you can draw. You have the information that has been presented in this lecture. Second, what is the threshold rule? We discussed this. We talked about the fact that innovators talk to other innovators or early adopters like innovators tend to talk to other people like them, whereas the early majority, as pragmatists, they avoid having, or they do not trust anyway, the information that flows through the conversations with early adopters. So what type of threshold rule would you have that? When do they become active? In this case, becoming active means adopting a technology which has an element of risk. We talked about that, so you should be able to give a rule of thumb about the threshold rule from innovators, the threshold rules for early adopters, the threshold rules for early majority. Then, with whom they are preferentially connected. This follows the nature of conversations they tend to have. So if you now actually draw the graph and draw the links between adopters, what do you find out? And then, once you've drawn it, make one innovator switch. And then on the basis of the connectivity, on the basis of threshold rules you have assigned, see whether that switch causes the adoption or the switching of nodes with which the focal node is connected with. And then the questions to ask, what to observe. Is the cascade, do you get any cascade? If you get a cascade, is it a local cascade, which means it lights up, it activates a number of nodes, but it fails to penetrate a large fraction or even the whole collapse. If these type of cascades on the basis of the threshold rules and the connectivity you have assigned are local, is there a way to rearrange a few links in order to cause a global cascade? And if yes, what type of links would you have to rewire? Imagine you are in a small world type of configuration. What type of links would you have to rewire? Among whom? Try to play this exercise homework, and we may discuss it next time. Finally, a couple of readings. I will upload an article by Jeffrey Moore, Darwin and the Demon, but I invite you to read at least the first chapter of Crossing the Chasm, which you will find in our library.